This video discusses reproduction in plants. If we just have a look over the terminology again, we know that meiosis is reduction division, so it's the division of diploid cells to result in haploid gametes. Gametes are also sex cells and they contain only half the chromosomes of a normal cell, so they contain a haploid amount of chromosomes. Because gametes are formed by meiosis, genetic variation is introduced by the process of meiosis because of crossing over, independent assortment, and random segregation, which we discussed in the meiosis video. The chromosomes are thread-like structures that are found in the nucleus of a cell, and they carry the information of heredity. Reproduction is the ability of an organism to produce a new generation of itself. So new individual or individuals are produced from an already existing individual. And an organism's genes are transferred to the next generation during reproduction, which is obviously vital for the survival and evolution of the species. So reproduction in plants will die of old age, of disease, of being eaten by other organisms, and so they need to undergo reproduction to produce new plants that can replace those that die. There's two types of reproduction, which we've spoken about quite extensively: asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. You can read over this yourself. I've spoken about the differences many times in these videos. Both asexual and sexual reproduction produce the same kind of organism as the parent organism, which prevents the species from dying out and from becoming extinct. And in terms of plant reproduction, both asexual and sexual reproduction allow food to be produced, which is vital to feed the world's growing population. If we look at some of the differences between asexual and sexual reproduction, obviously asexual has one parent, sexual has two parents that each have their own gender, male and female. In asexual, there is only one stage of the process. Meiosis is the only stage. So it's a lot faster than sexual reproduction, which is why we often use asexual reproduction for farming. Sexual reproduction is two stages. There's meiosis, and then fertilization needs to occur for the two cells to fuse. No gametes are formed in asexual reproduction, but gametes are formed for sexual. For the end product, for asexual reproduction, we know that the offspring are genetically identical. The only variation occurs is if there's a mutation. Whereas for sexual reproduction, the offspring are genetically different to each other and to the parents because of variation during meiosis and during fertilization. For asexual and sexual reproduction in plants, there's different value. In a stable environment, the asexual reproduction can be quite helpful because well-adapted individuals are continuously reproduced. And we can reproduce where there's very little or no mates. But in a changing environment, individuals can adapt to these new conditions because each of them have variation in their features. So it's a much more beneficial in an unstable environment than asexual reproduction would be. Obviously, as we said, the rate of reproduction for asexual is much faster. Firstly, because all individuals can reproduce offspring. It doesn't require a male and a female, and you only have one stage. For sexual reproduction, it's a lot slower because only half the population can actually produce the offspring, that is, the females, and males are also required. And of course, there are two stages, and the organisms need to be sexually mature to undergo sexual reproduction. A lot less energy is needed for asexual reproduction because energy is only needed for mitosis. There's no energy for meiosis or to form gametes or to find mates, as there is in sexual reproduction. For asexual reproduction, outside agents aren't needed, but for sexual reproduction, agents such as pollinators, such as bees, birds, and wind are often needed. Asexual reproduction, as we said, doesn't allow organisms to adapt to the environment because there's no genetic variation, whereas in sexual, it does allow this. For asexual reproduction, there's very little possibility of evolution because there's very little genotype variation. The only variation is in mutation. But in sexual reproduction, there's a lot higher chance of evolution. Some of the advantages of asexual reproduction, as we said, all individuals can produce offspring, which uses less energy. It's a fast and simple process. And it's very useful in stable environments because if the parent is well adapted, then it's guaranteed that the offspring will also be well adapted. It's also advantageous because if there's a favorable mutation, it can spread very quickly because asexual reproduction happens so quickly. And this allows the population to adapt quickly to the new environmental conditions. For example, resistance to antibiotics. Some of the disadvantages of asexual reproduction is that there's no variation unless there's a mutation. So in a changing environment, the population could be unable to adapt and they may die very quickly. And because asexual reproduction can happen so quickly, overcrowding may occur, which means that there's resources that are in short supply. Some of the advantages of sexual reproduction is, of course, variation, which provides evolution. It gives organisms a better chance of survival in unstable environments because they might be able to adapt to new conditions. It can prevent the spread of disease because the offspring can be born with a genetic resistance to the disease, and it can reduce the chance of inheriting a disease from the parent because the offspring may not get the gene for the disease. The disadvantages of sexual reproduction is, as we said, a high expenditure of energy because of the organs of reproduction, the gametes, the finding a mate in, obviously not in plants, but in animals, and the 2 stages, mitosis and meiosis. The reproductive process is a lot slower, and if there's unfavorable mutations and recessive genes, they could be expressed in the offspring. Also, outside agents such as pollinators may be needed. So now we're going to look at sexual reproduction in angiosperms, which are flowering plants, where they have flowers as reproductive organs. So these would all be angiosperms. Angiosperms are plants that reproduce by means of seeds produced within flowers. They're the most evolved of all the plants. Their ovules are enclosed inside an ovary and they aren't naked on a cone like gymnosperms. Gymnosperms are not flowering plants, they're plants that have cones. So what is a flower? A flower is a structure of a plant that has the reproductive organs inside it, and often it attracts pollinators. Many flowers make both male and female gametes. The male gametes are found inside pollen grains. Don't get confused, the male gametes aren't the pollen grains themselves, but they're found inside the pollen grains, and they're produced by anthers. The female gametes are found inside the ovules, and they're enclosed by the ovary. Flowers develop from flower buds, and flower buds would be meristematic tissue, so unspecialized tissue, which then undergoes mitosis to form flower buds. Flower buds develop from the apical meristem, which is like the top meristem, but don't stress about this, it's not that important. Each bud in a flower contains 4 concentric walls of flower plants, which are these 4 walls. As we see here, the first one would be a wall of sepals, which altogether are called the calyx. And these are usually green, and their main function is just to simply protect the flower. Then we have a wall of petals, which are altogether called the corolla, and they're often bright colored to attract pollinators. We then have the stamens, which each consist of an anther and a filament. So altogether, this would be a stamen. The top part is an anther, which we can see has produced pollen grains, which contain the male gamete. And this long part here is the filament. These are the male gamete producing structures. One of the nuclei in the pollen grain is the haploid male gamete, which has been produced by meiosis. And the last structure is a carpel, which inside it contains an ovule, which inside that contains the female haploid nuclei, so the female gamete. Each carpel has a stigma, a style, and an ovary. As you can see here, the stigma is this top little bit, the style is like the long tube, and here we have an ovary inside of which there are ovules. So if we just look at altogether the structure of a plant, we can see here we have the sepals, altogether called the calyx. We can see we have the petals here, which are together called the corolla. We then have the male parts. So altogether this is a stamen, and this top part is an anther where the pollen is produced. This long part is the filament. We can then see the female part of the flower called the carpel, and another name for the carpel is the pistil. It then has the top part called the stigma. It has the long style tube. It has an ovary inside of which there's an ovule, and inside the ovule is a female gametes. Together, the petals, so the corolla, and the sepals, so the calyx, can be called the perianther. Here's another picture. It's really important to know the different structures of the plant and their functions. Again, another picture. And another one. So we know that the male part of the flower is the stamen, consisting of the anther here and the filament. The anther is the structure that forms the pollen grains, inside of which we find the male gametes. We can see here that there's an anther, and as you can see, most flowers have both male and female parts. Just quickly to be able to remember which parts belong to the male and which parts belong to the female, a quick, easy shortcut is the male parts have man or men in them, so stamen, anther or manther, just add an M, and filament. And then the female parts, this is another quick way to learn it. Obviously, you can know that it's the stigma and the style and the ovary, so the things that don't have man and men in them. Or you can go stigma, ma is a term for a female parent, the style, every woman has style, and females, of course, have ovaries. Why do plants use flowers? Well, we need to find a solution for not being able to move. Plants are obviously, they lack locomotion, they can't move, which means that the gametes, which are single, delicate cells, they're easily damaged. They need to cross-pollinate, they need to move to different flowers. But since flowers can't move, we need a solution for this. And flowers can be a solution. It allows the two gametes to reach each other safely. Flowers also allow, they provide a mechanism to disperse their offspring far enough away from the parent, which prevents competition, as if all the offspring was simply located right next to the parent, they'd compete for light, water, and soil minerals. So flowers solve this problem. If we then just look at the difference between pollination and fertilization. Pollination is the act of transferring pollen from the anther to the stigma, which allows for fertilization to occur and obviously for reproduction to occur. When the anther is mature, it splits open and releases the pollen. The pollen is then carried to the stigma by natural means. So it can either be by insects, by wind, sometimes by birds or even bats, by humans artificially, which is obviously not a natural mean, which happens in plant breeding. There's a few different agents of pollination, insects, birds, bats, wind, or even water. The most important ones are wind and insect pollination. So if we just compare the structure of wind-pollinated flowers and insect-pollinated flowers, for wind pollination flowers, their petals are often brown or dull, and they have no scent and nectar because they don't need to attract insects. The pollen is often produced in great quantities because there's quite a low chance of it reaching another flower, so it needs to produce a lot of pollen. The pollen's light and smooth so that the wind can blow it. The anthers are loosely attached and they dangle outwards to release pollen into the wind. The stigma hangs outside the flower, so it hangs usually upside down outside the flower, and this is to catch the drifting pollen. And the stigma is also feathery or net-like, again, to catch this pollen that's been blown by the wind. So we can see here, this would be an example of a wind-pollinated flower. If we then look at insect-pollinated flowers, they need large, brightly colored petals, often with nectar and sweetly scented, in order to attract insects. They need less pollen than wind-pollinated flowers because it's more likely to reach the other plants, so there's less wastage. Pollen's often sticky or spiky to stick to insects. The anthers are firm and inside the flower, which brushes against the insect. And the stigma is also inside the flower, allowing the insect to brush against it. The stigma also has a sticky coating to allow the pollen to stick to it. So we can see here, this would be an example of an insect-pollinated flower. We can see the two different plants. It's quite easy to see which one would be an insect-pollinated and which one would be wind-pollinated. There's two types of pollen transfer. There's firstly cross-pollination, which is from one plant to another plant, of a different, one flower to another flower of a different plant. So it transferred from the anther of one plant to the stigma of another plant. Obviously, they have to be of the same species because otherwise a successful reproduction couldn't occur. And cross-pollination allows for genetic variation of offspring. So cross-pollination we can see is one plant going to another plant. Self-pollination is pollen is transferred from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or to another flower on the same plant. So if we see here, this would be the same plant, but two different flowers. Transferring from plant A to plant B here is still self-pollination because these flowers have grown from the same original seed. So they all have the same genetic information, they're genetically identical. So no genetic variation occurs in self-pollination. There's also, of course, artificial pollination, which is when pollen is taken from one flower to another by humans. If we come back to the difference between pollination and fertilization, we spoke quite a lot about pollination. If we now look at fertilization, we know that this is the joining of two haploid cells, so the male gamete and the female gamete, to form a diploid zygote. The zygote develops by mitosis, so the cells replicate and divide, and into the adult plant. Fertilization will occur after pollination. Fertilization happens when the pollen grain lands on the stigma. So the pollen grain is now being transferred from the anther to the stigma. It develops a pollen tube that grows along down the style and into the ovule, which is contained inside the ovary. The pollen tube carries the male gamete. It doesn't carry the pollen grain, just the male gamete, down the style and into the ovule. The gamete then enters the ovule and fertilization can occur. After fertilization, the embryo will develop and the seed can begin to form. So just remember that the pollen is not the actual gamete. The pollen contains the gamete inside it. Once fertilization has occurred, the ovary will form the fruit of the plant and the ovule forms the seed. So we can see here that if we have an anther here with a filament over there, the pollen grains move from the anther to the stigma, where pollination, so this is the process of pollination. Then the pollen tube will grow and the male gamete will move down the style into the ovule, where fertilization can then occur. So of course, this would be the difference between pollination and fertilization. Pollination is the transferal of a ripe pollen grain from the anther of a flower to the mature stigma of another flower of the same type, so of the same species. Fertilization, in talking specifically about plants, is when the male gamete from the pollen grain fuses with the female gamete inside the ovule to form a diploid zygote. This is the same process. It's just saying the same thing as in the fertilization slide. And we know that the fertilized ovule becomes the seed and the ovary wall usually becomes the fruit. So we can see that the tomato is actually a fruit, as most people will know. It has seeds formed from the ovule and its outer coat is the ovary. And it's here at the top, there's actually the remains of the sepal of the calyx. So once the seed has grown, so pollination has occurred, fertilization has occurred. Now the seed is mature and the fruit is ripe. The seeds and the fruit have to be dispersed so that competition can be reduced between the parent and the offspring. Plants have developed a lot of different ways to maximize the dispersal of the seeds and of the fruit. Don't confuse this with pollination. It's very similar because, of course, objects are transferred from one plant or from one place to another. But for pollination, that's the actual pollen grains that are being transferred, whereas in seed dispersal, it's the seeds and the fruit that are being transferred. So they can travel by wind, through animals, from water, by bursting and just splitting out, which will help with the wind, and humans can also transfer them. Some of the advantages of seed dispersal is that it lowers the competition between individuals, so between the offspring themselves and between the offspring and the parent organism, because there's often competition for limited resources like light, water, and minerals in the soil. It also gives the potential for the offspring to be dispersed to environments that are more favorable for the growth and development, which allows there to be a greater chance of the survival of the species. So just don't confuse pollination, fertilization, and seed dispersal. Make sure you know the difference between these three processes. And that's pretty much it for the first part of plant reproduction. We'll have a look a bit later at asexual reproduction in plants.